Okay, let's get started building that new project. I have cloned empty project template, so I don't have anything there. When I start a new project, usually I open up the README, and this is the standard template README, and I will start with the why. That helps me decide what feature to include in the project. So to give you a quick introduction, whenever you use Laravel queues or Symfony Messenger or libraries like that, you usually get features like serialization of objects like jobs, messages, whatever the name is. We also get features like retries, handling of failed messages, which on AWS is called the dead letter queue pattern, but it's basically a way to store failed messages. And we have, very important as well, driver abstraction. So for example, you can run online with SQS, RabbitMQ, and locally with a sync driver or database driver or whatever. And that part is really useful. So anyway, whenever we use Amazon SQS or EventBridge, we have those features with Lambda, and we don't need to implement them with code anymore. So that's really, really great. But when we use SQS and EventBridge directly, we lose those features. We have to serialize our objects into JSON manually, and we lose any kind of decoupling to the driver. So whenever we run stuff locally, we are using SQS online. So I want to solve those problems. That's what the library will be about. Let's ignore the rest for now. We need to focus on this. So for a driver abstraction, let's identify our use cases. Let's forget about tests for now. We'll just write some kind of interface or class. Let's set up a namespace properly. So it will be Bref Messaging. And will be, let's start with PHP 8 for now. Okay, we'll do that later. Let's start. Of course, we'll be able to create a class now, and we'll think about the name later. Maybe we'll change it. That's okay. So what we'll want to do is dispatch messages, dispatch jobs or events. So a message here, let's talk about the vocabulary. Message could be background job, and for that we would probably use SQS or even invoke Lambda async invocation, like invoke Lambda directly, or it could be an event. An EventBridge is perfect for that. So should we go like dispatch, and then we would have some kind of message class or interface and have message? Or should we separate the use cases? I'm not sure. So it could be run job, and then, so those are the two options, like notify event. So this one would go on Lambda or SQS, and this one would go on EventBridge. But do we need to separate that? I like the fact of having one method, but I'm always really careful about being too abstract. And that's something I dislike about the Symfony Messenger component. I mean, technically it's a very good component, but it's really hard for users to understand what it does and to understand the problem it solves. So here I'm dispatching a message, but what does it really mean? Here I'm running a background job, and it's much clearer what I can do with that. Here I'm dispatching an event through system. So again, I think it's a bit clearer, but do we need that? Will the code be any different? let's think about how these things will be handled. So let's say I'm using SQS. Let's say I'm using EventBridge. I think the handler will be, I mean, the job will be a bit the same. So how? Okay, let's say I'm using the project, whatever, and I've created a class which is like a generate report. So what would that be? It would be a job, a background job. It would extend or implement some interface. And then I need both data in there. So it could be, for example, private invoice ID or project ID. Actually, we could even do it like that. Let's go PHP 8, right? I like to format it like that for PHP 8. So we have state in our class, and this class and this property would be serialized to JSON whenever it's sent to EventBridge or SQS. Okay, great. But then we need to handle and actually implement the logic, right? We have on one hand the state and on one hand the logic. When you look at Laravel jobs, they have that in the same class. So they have a handle method, and in there you use like this project ID, and then you can run whatever you want. I'm not sure if I'm a huge fan of that, because it mixes both the state and the logic, and sometimes you have different microservices. One microservice will be responsible for dispatching an event or dispatching a job, and the actual logic will be in a separate code base in a different microservice, maybe written by another team. So being able to have the state at some point and the logic in another code base makes sense to me. So it makes more sense to me to have the like this would be the handler or whatever, and it would be a service. One thing to note as well here too is that this is stateless logic that is dependent on the actual data here. So it could be written as a service like this, and it could be the message or whatever. And now I have decoupled my state and my actual logic. The downside is that I have to write two classes, but it offers much more flexibility, especially on Lambda and on AWS, where you could want to write different Lambda functions to separate the code bases, to write small Lambda functions. So I think I will go that way. I will separate the state from the logic, and let's see where it gets us. So that means the original question was, would there be any difference here? We would always have data, which is a plain old PHP object, and the handler. I think in both cases we have the same kind of behavior. So going that route may make sense. Now, do we really need an interface here? On paper, it sounds great because you can type your arguments, but in reality, when I'm dispatching a class, so let me put that in a different file. Okay, and this one would be, okay, yeah. Let's make it public for now. Right, so I'm in my code base. I'm writing a simple PHP class. Why would I need an interface? Right? Now the question would be, if I get an object here, so it has to be an object, right? But how do I serialize that? So I was thinking about using the Symfony Serializer, which is a Symfony component that turns objects to either JSON or arrays and back the other way. So that's what I want. I want to deal with arrays because whenever I will use the, send data to SQS or to EventBridge, I will need to JSON encode that. I'm not sure I want that part. I don't really care about. Doing a simple JSON encode would be enough. I think. So I think that would be good. One thing as well here is that I want to have the void return type. So dispatching a job or an event, you don't expect anything in return. You should not. If you do, then it's not an asynchronous dispatching of a message. It's a synchronous call. So we don't want to return anything. Now here, let's say I was using SQS. So let's require. I will not use the official PHP SDK from AWS because it's a huge package, and when you have a look at it, it contains code for all AWS services. It's huge. It's like 50 megabytes or something. And on Lambda, it's a downside because it makes your application bigger, you can hit the limits, and it slows down the call starts. So we prefer using smaller packages, and that's great because we have the async AWS organization that creates very small packages targeting a single service. So for example here SQS, and that's perfect because that's what I wanted to try. So let's do that. And let's take that example. That would be perfect. So let's say for now, I'm not decoupling anything. I don't have any driver thing. I will simply send to SQS. So that obviously will go into the constructor or something, but let's keep that for now. So create queue. No, we don't want to create any queue. We want to dispatch messages. What we want to do is there's actually a simpler way to do that. Oh, no, sorry. Okay. I'm mistaken. Oh, okay, it's either an array like this or it's an object. Makes sense. That's interesting. Do I get any auto-completion? No. On TypeScript, you do get auto-completion like this. It's really, really interesting. So let's not do that. Let's use the object. Okay, that's what we want. We will not check the output. So obviously the queue URL will be a variable, but let's move that out of the way for now. This is where we want to serialize our message here. So as a very first iteration, let's use JSON and code like this. Very, very dirty. This is the simplest way to do it. Now let's make it a bit better. I want to have drivers. Of course, I want to be able to target SQS. So we could call that driver, we could call that transport, channel, whatever. I'll stick with driver and we will have, so okay, let's start small. And this is roughly what it will look like. It will not take an object because the driver will not be responsible for serializing the object. I think for now it could take an array, like a directly JSON serializable array. And we will leave the normalization of the object into an array to that class. So we get an array, a clean array, we can send it. Now let's make that a bit better. Usually what I do is pass that class as a constructor parameter. I like to call it just SQS because that's the SQS client, and that looks a bit simpler and more explicit. There we go. And let's use PHP 8. Now that is perfect because I can then get rid of that, but it's not really user-friendly to ask the user to pass that object. I mean, most of the time. Especially since on Lambda you don't need that, it's already pre-configured by Lambda. So what I like to do is keep that constructor like this. This allows me to easily mock the client, the service in tests. So I want to keep passing the object, but I want to provide a simpler method for users. So I will use a static function, which is like a static constructor. And let's call it create for now. Let's use the region. There is no, usually a pattern is to have array and like options, okay? And then you can do return new self, and there you go. You know, something like this. Okay, it's just a bit clearer. Then we can have that. Oops. But since PHP 8, we have named parameters. So, and we know that we don't really want to pass that very probably. So could we maybe do something like region $. Okay, that's an ID. Why? So here I could then do that. Okay, want to have a default. No, okay. Like this. So that way, as a user, so let me create a scratch file, PHP. As a user, I know that I need to provide the region, right? So I can do that. And I don't have to provide any extra option because it's a variadic parameter here. But if I want to, I could. Sorry, not an array. That would be like, let's say I want to provide the credentials, like the access key ID. So thanks to PHP 8, I could do this. And I could even do region like this. And it looks a lot like the array, except, you know, I get, oh. Am I mistaken? So what I would expect here would be that if I pass any extra option, extra parameter, it will be caught in the options array, and it will be an array. Like this would be the key and this would be the value. But let's test that. Let's test that. I like testing when I have a doubt. I have a key on the keyboard that doesn't work in, come on, autocomplete please. Doesn't work on eval.org. Now if I go create, what do I get? What do you think? Perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. So that means that I can add any extra option, and these will be passed to the SQS client. So that way, these options are completely extensible. They are clear to read, and I don't have, and I can, offer auto-completion on specific options that I want to, where I want to require it or guide users on how to use it. So let's say I'm like that, and users are like, okay, what do I need? Okay, what do I need here? I need region. Is it working like that? Anyway, I have, ID, not auto-completion, but validation at least. So that looks good to me. SQS and SQS. We can get rid of that. And I think, and then we have the queue URL. So that's interesting. So now there's a question of should. So let's say I'm using the messaging class. And let's say I pass the SQS driver. That's not really how it works for now, but that's okay. Should I dispatch my job on a specific queue? Where do I set the queue? I could set it here, so I have a single driver, SQS driver. So basically, does the SQS driver represents SQS in general, or does it represent a single queue? And I think it should be a single queue, because else that means that here I would have to pass the queue URL, and what about, migrating to EventBridge? That makes no sense in EventBridge. But then, in Symfony Messenger, you can have many drivers. Like I have the SQS driver, and I can have EventBridge driver, and whatever. And then you have many drivers. So when you dispatch a job, the question is, where does the job or the message goes? Should it go into this SQS driver or this other queue? Because it could be actually SQS Q1, SQS Q2. Should it go in this one or this one or this one? And then you have a concept of routing. And that gets, in my opinion, quite complex. We have an example. Let me use the framework documentation. Routing, that's here. And so you say, okay, this class goes into this transport. It could be SQS or EventBridge. And so you have to do it like this. And I understand this choice. It means that you can send a single message to multiple drivers. But I'm not sure I want to follow the same pattern, because I dislike this multi-step configuration. Like you create a job or a message, and then you configure SQS or EventBridge, and then you have to think about, okay, for each message that I have to configure the routing. So maybe there could be only one driver, and that is like a bus or whatever, but it's a messaging instance. And if you dispatch there, it goes into this specific queue. And if you have a different queue, you have a different messaging target or whatever. And then you can dispatch another message into that different queue. I like to keep things simple. So essentially the result is the same, but you have one less concept. You don't have routing. You basically do the routing manually. And I think if you don't need the routing, if you have a single SQS queue or a single EventBridge bus, whatever, if you have a single target, it's simpler because there's one less concept that's useless to you. Okay, so if you don't need it, it's simpler. But if you do need it, it's not simpler, but it's not more complex. So I think it's a win in some scenario and it's a draw in the other scenario. So all in all, it's a win using that pattern, I think. So that means that you may not have a single messaging instance in your whole application. Then you could also have, and that's the beauty, of abstractions that's actually, yeah, you could have like let's say messaging is an interface, or you could have like, okay, let me explain that. Messaging again. You could have a class like that, and you could replicate the routing system where, okay, so message 1 instances will go to messaging 1, and actually we don't even need the first parameters. And sorry, that would be, yeah, that would like that. So you could have an extra class that does the routing, but having simpler setup like this, I think that's good. Also, what I like about that, but do we even need this then? Is that class even necessary? Because we have two problems to solve. One is actually sending the message, like the driver. So that logic. And the second problem we have is the serialization. We don't really want to duplicate the serialization in each driver, but the serialization, instead of having a wrapper object like this doing the serialization and in calling private drivers. So far I don't have any interface, but I will. Oops. Then we want to like serial array. So we want to transform that into an array and dispatch that. So we go from an object to an array. Okay, let's just for the sake of the example. So the logic in there is just the conversion, right? But could that be in a serialization class? Serializer, and that would be turns an object into an array. And so here we don't even need that class because we could have the serializer injected in here. Oops. Now it becomes a bit more complex to use, maybe for users to configure. Or not, because it could be like, so this is an optional parameter, and if it's null, we can create a default instance, so you can pass your custom serializer or we will create it for you. So for users, it's still as simple as that. You can, however, provide your own serializer if you want to. And then SQS Q1, you can get rid of that. And there you go. make it a bit clearer. So I like that because that's one less class and one less concept. If we don't implement the router in the first version, that's even simpler. Like you have a serializer and drivers, and that's it. We only have talked, of course, about dispatching messages, and we need to talk about handlers, but let's do that after that. So let's go for that for now. I really like that approach. We will have an interface afterwards, but for now, let's do that. And you know, I'm also thinking maybe each driver will want to serialize things differently. So I'm not sure. And so here, the queue URL, we probably want to have that as a mandatory parameter. And so the driver will actually be is driver the right name? Let's keep that for now. So we will have that here. Oops. Okay, now we will get an object here because we have to do the serialization ourselves, and that would be like oops, that's a typo anyway. It's not really a serializer because it does not generate JSON, but it's like a normalizer, they call it in Symfony, whatever. So that is an option. And for the user, we have to pass the queue URL. Oops. So here, and that's okay, that's something I really care about. Usually you have like the driver interface and you have implementations and you prefix or suffix the thing because everything needs to be organized and consistent. But I don't work like that anymore. Now, what I do is I try to write classes that represent whatever, you know, with a name that represents what the class is about. In here, we are actually pushing into, the name here is explicit, into a queue, SQS. So the name should probably be SQS. Yes, it's a driver, but the driver leads to an SQS. Which, again, there's the question, should we really have the name driver anywhere? What could it be? Let's refactor now and extract an interface. What is this? Is this the driver? Is this a transport? Is this a target? Okay, this is messaging component. So maybe this is a bus. Maybe this is I am messaging. I am sending messages. Or a dispatcher. A message target. Let's be messenger. Destination. Okay, we need maybe what it isn't that important. It's also a mistake I make a lot, like thinking about what it is and not what it does. Because an interface, you know, when you name a class, okay, it's what it is because it contains the code and everything. But with an interface, you don't have to think about what's in there, but where it will be used. So I'm in a controller, and I have like a request, and I need to dispatch a message. And what I care about is injecting whatever will let me dispatch the message. Or, so it's a dispatcher, maybe. I want to send the message somewhere. It could be a queue, it could be an event bus. Okay, let's call it a dispatcher for now. We have plenty of time to refactor that. I love refactoring continuously. We'll move that up to the root. Let's rename that. Let's not rename the directory, but rename the namespace itself. Let's rename that to target for now. It's a bit more explicit, like a target for dispatching. So this is what you will want to inject in your controllers and everything. And that sounds pretty simple and good. You can dispatch to a queue. You can dispatch to EventBridge. And now let's talk about the handler. That will be solved in a way like the Symfony component or something else, but it's not a huge problem because it's been solved all over the place. Now, with the handler, it's a bit different than what exists in Laravel queues and the Symfony Messenger component. Why? Because in those instances, or more specifically, when using Bref, when running code on AWS Lambda, usually you have your handler extends like the SQS handler. Oh, wait. We need Bref. And oops, nope, I wanted to add the method. And what we have, so let's command that. It forces us to implement that method with it, which is like handle SQS event. And that event is not at all our generate report class, right? Because, so one way to do it, one way to use the package would be like, okay, I will be injecting the serializer, private serializer, and oh, it's such a mess. And I will be using the serializer to deserialize. So that's a method that I will probably add later. And then we have our generate report instance. Let's type that just for auto-completion, and then we are good. We can work on that. So that line of code, could we get rid of that? Do we need that? Could we turn that into, let's remove that, into something like handle message, just to avoid any conflict. One is a bit simpler, obviously. So let's think about that. The advantage here is that we are sure that we get an object of the correct class. If we don't, there will be an error, and there could be, like, if our project does that, like messaging, does the verification, then we can have a very clear and explicit error, and that's good. Instead, if we go that way, then what guarantee do we have that we will have this specific instance? We could probably, and will probably need to specify which class we want. So actually, the deserializer could check and say, okay, it's not, it doesn't really work. We can't generate that. So here's an error. Now let's get back to the README. You know, we said why. This is an important feature of the project, so I think we shouldn't do it manually. Right? So what could happen is Bref or the library tries to knows that it needs to call that handler and checks the type hint, says, okay, we need a class of that type, and so we'll turn the event, and that would actually be done by the library. Now, ideally, whenever I write, let's do Bref init event-driven function, just to give you an example. So I'll remove that file, which is useless. I wanted to have a serverless.yml file just to have an example. What I would want to have, ideally, would be, so that's the SQS worker, and I want to be able to put the class name here, right? And so that's noise, let's put it here. And events SQS, ooh, nope. Oh, how did that? Oh, nice. Okay. And this is the blah 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 blah. This is the identifier of our queue. So whenever there's a new message in the queue, this will be called. Now, natively in Bref, we can put class names like this with the PSR11 integration. So how does this work? Basically, we have to have init.php, like any file at the root. So here it would not be the code of the library, it's just an example of how to use it in a real project. And here we would return like create like a new container, a dependency injection container, and Bref, you would use that to create new instances of that. Okay, but let's say the container creates a new instance of that, and I don't want to extend the SQS handler. Oh. So this is the class from Bref. What we could do, is have, and that's just an ID. Messaging SQS handler, just to have a different name. And I could have that here, and then that would be an abstract function. But I can't know the, and so, sorry, just to finish here, that would be basically this handle message, and that would be the message. And the serializer, yeah, I need, however, to have the serializer available. So that's, I think that's, and I don't know, like I can't type that, I can't just leave it like that, because then this one would extend, and it would say, okay, no, you cannot make the type more specific because it breaks the interface or the abstract, the extend. So I have to do it like that, and then I lose the interest because I can't cast. So sure, I could use PHP 8 attributes, but I don't want to do that because I want, native as native to PHP as possible. So that's not good, and that is actually a very good illustration of using class inheritance to solve problems that should not be solved by class inheritance. Class inheritance puts too much constraints on our code, and that's usually a sign that you're doing something wrong. So I was doing something that was apparently wrong, and that makes sense. So I don't really want to extend anything. Can I do something like not extend anything? I mean, how will I be able to force? So let's ignore the Bref connection part for now. Let's say I have an interface that defines a message handler. Okay, and I don't need that. That's an interface, and I want that to be like handle message, and I can't type int because the type int will depend on the implementation. So that's the same problem. So how do I force handlers to have a method that is named properly? How do I enforce that? I'm not sure. How do they do that in, let's say, Laravel queues? I think in Laravel it's all about convention. Like the method should be called handle, and that's it. If you have a typo in there, that's your problem. I think it would just not work. That's my what I expect. In Symfony, so they have a separate class for handlers, and you have the message, which is the data, just like what I did, and you have the handler. And the handler implements message interface, and I think they use invoke. They don't really type. Let me check. Symfony messenger. Okay, here it is. MessageHandler interface. Right. Marker interface. So what's called a marker interface is an interface that doesn't contain anything. So theoretically it's useless, but it can be used to do like instance of MessageHandler. Okay, you know, it's to have instance of checks, and as the name says, it's a way to mark the class and say it's a MessageHandler. So Symfony uses the invoke magic method, which is fine, but one problem with using that specific method is that it conflicts with any other class that wants to use the invoke method for something else. So I'm still thinking here. So we could go, in both cases, that's actually a convention. Both expect either to have a method named, let's remove that, named handle or invoke. In both cases, they don't enforce it with an interface. So I'm guessing they have the same problem here. So basically I can choose, I can have that handle or invoke or whatever name I prefer. Let's say it's in handle. Now, let's go with handle. How do I bridge that with Bref now? I don't want to inject the serializer. I don't want to have that. How do I deal with that? So let's remove that, or yeah, we could have the marker interface. I'm not sure if it's, if it's really useful, but let's keep it for now. Here, it means that we will have the message handler, right? That's yeah. Anyway, That's expected because there is no method there, so it can't validate that method call. Now, how do I say to Bref, that class, you need to don't actually call, you know, new and then handle, because that's not really a Bref handler. You need to call, oops, that, like you need to do something like new, blah, 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 blah. That's not really possible. I mean, yeah, no, it is possible technically. It is possible if you do some crazy stuff here, which I already did actually in the Bref web framework. So I have some ideas. I'll stop for now, right there, and I'll continue thinking about that, because that's a really interesting problem, and I think that's a problem that is beyond, that is more global to just SQS and EventBridge handlers, and that goes maybe into the whole Bref territory on how to write handlers and how to connect that with frameworks and containers and you know, so just to give you a hint, I have the same problem with HTTP middlewares when writing HTTP applications using functions like this. So I can put controllers here, but I need to wrap that with middlewares. Anyway, I'll think about that. If you've followed so far, I hope your head is not ready to explode. Have a coffee or take a nap. Thank you for following and see you next time.